So I can go too if Ed is not here.
Okay. I'll get started then. So thanks for attending this session. Do opportunity zones create opportunities? The first paper we're going to have is the non-effect of opportunity zones on housing prices. And Kevin, you can get started. Thanks.
And can I suggest you wait just 1 minute, because if you look at the participant count, it's still rising. So I think,
okay, sorry, I should figure out how to get that up. Let's wait a sec.
It's pretty much stopped rising. Just give it a minute.
Okay.
Okay, I think it stopped climbing, so that's good.
Okay, thanks, David. So I'm really happy to have the opportunity to chair this session, and thanks to Alina and Andra and Morris for putting it together. Do opportunity zones create opportunities? And the first paper we're going to have is the non-effect of opportunity zones on housing prices. Kevin, Ed, and David. Kevin.
Thanks everyone for tuning in, and Happy New Year. My name is Kevin Chen. I'm a graduate student at Harvard University, and this is some work that I did with Ed Glazer and David Wessel at Brookings, and Glazer is at Harvard. Looking at the effect of opportunity zones on housing prices. And to just give some motivation, one good policy question is whether the government should help poor people or poor places. So helping poor people is like the creating moves to opportunity that folks at Harvard are doing, and helping poor places is like subsidizing investment to low opportunity areas, something that opportunity zones do. And there are strong arguments against place-based policies. It mostly helps landowners in these places and might hurt renters, and it certainly distorts migration decisions made by people. But place-based policies are indeed popular. Spatial inequities are stark, and politicians, after all, are elected based on places. So this is a quote from Senator Tim Scott's website, who's the architect behind the Opportunity Zones program. More than 50 million Americans currently live in economically distressed communities. The Opportunity Zones put the decision-making in the hands of state and local leaders who know their communities best. And so you can sort of intuit from what he's saying that there are some legitimate economic arguments for place-based policies as well. It internalizes local externalities, and it's potentially able to target aid with less distortion. And so one question that we have with this project is whether the Opportunity Zones program accomplish these tasks. And so to begin, let me give you some institutional background on Opportunity Zones, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. So the Opportunity Zones program is part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, under which governors nominate 25% of eligible census tracts in the state. And the census tract is eligible either because it is a low-income community according to the definitions in the law, or it is contiguous and geographically adjacent to a low-income community. And there are about 32,000 tracts that are eligible in total, of which about 9,000 of them are selected in the program. And the vast majority of these 9,000 opportunity zones are indeed low-income communities. And the Opportunity Zones program confers various investment tax incentives for these selected tracts. Capital gains tax on real estate investments made in these zones, it may be deferred, reduced, or even eliminated depending on the length of the investment horizon. And just an issue on timing, the law is signed into law at the end of 2017, and the selection of the opportunity zones are finalized mid-2018, so we can take this July 9th date as some sort of start date of the program. And the CEA estimates that till the end of 2019, about $75 billion of private capital investment is raised and invested in these opportunity zones. So this project investigates whether opportunity zone status had an effect on residential housing prices. And let's just sort of think through theoretically why this might be the case. And broadly speaking, there are two channels why we might expect higher investment to affect housing prices, namely demand and supply. On the demand side, if we expect the investment to result in positive neighborhood improvements or to result in sort of better jobs through investment in commercial properties, then we should expect that the demand effects are going to push residential property value in the tracts up. On the other hand, on the supply side, it is possible that new housing would drive the price down, but it's also possible that this effect is at least modulated by the scarcity of land. Right, so if existing properties has to be converted into new properties, then you'd expect that at least temporarily land prices will rise, contributing to a positive effect on residential property value. And of course, the strengths of all of these arrows would depend on the respective elasticities of the relevant markets at hand. For example, if the supply for residential properties is perfectly inelastic, the quantities would never change, then there certainly wouldn't be this downward price movement pressure due to increased residential supply. And so in this paper, we investigate two hypotheses. The first hypothesis is whether the opportunity zone tax credits increase residential property value. And the second hypothesis is whether the tax credit have a differential impact on commercial versus residential areas. Since predicted by the theory, the OZ tax credit should increase property value more so in commercial areas. And before I talk about data and methodology, let's just give you a preview of our results. So on the first question, whether the opportunity zone status increased property value, we produce a range of treatment effects estimates, which mostly do not reject zero and certainly rules out large effects of more than 1.5 percentage points on growth per year. And on the second hypothesis, whether opportunity zone tax credits have a differential impact on commercial versus residential areas in the direction we would predict, we find some relatively weak evidence. So the point estimate is indeed in the direction that theory would suggest, but the standard error is also large enough for us to not be able to conclude that this is statistically distinct from zero. And our work stands somewhat in contrast to some non-academic work conducted by Zillow and Atom Data Solutions using proprietary data. And both of these sources conclude some massive home price increases in opportunity zones. But their inferences are dubious since they use sort of kind of opaque and proprietary data that are probably not based on repeated sales. And so it will fail to control for quality of the unit. And it also has sort of standard causal inference problems in terms of whether the control group is right and whether parallel trends really hold in their sample. Since our initial working paper, which only included 2018 data, the CEA also came out with a report. And in that report, they actually replicate our initial work. And they also did a follow-up work, which we do here as well with the 2019 house data, price data, and they find an estimate of about positive 0.5 percentage points, which is in the range of our estimates, though I admit it's on the higher end of our estimates. And so to give you a picture of what I mean by the non-academic work, this is like a plot that's produced by Zillow Economic Research, where the green line here is price growth trends for census tracts that are selected to become opportunity zones. And the yellow line here is for census tracts that are eligible to become opportunity zones, but are not selected. And so the researcher is intending for the green to be a suitable sort of, the yellow to be a suitable control group for the green, but you can see that the trends doesn't sort of match up super well here. And it also results in somewhat large positive price treatment effects in terms of like 10 to 15 percentage points, which our numbers do not suggest. So to briefly just talk about the data sources, we basically need three types of data, right? We need the outcome variable, the treatment variable, and observed covariates. And the outcome variable we're going to use is the growth in the FHFA's housing price index, which is a weighted and repeated sales index of single-family housing prices. And we're just going to use the successive ratio as growth. And we're going to separate our analyses for the unit either at a census tract level or at a zip code level. And the reason for doing this is the FHFA's housing price index has relatively poor coverage for census tracts. And so we add the zip level analysis as a robustness check. The treatment is very straightforward. It's whether a tract is selected as an opportunity zone, eligible to become selected as an opportunity zone, or not selected. And that data is from the Urban Institute. And again, and the covariates are also kind of standard. We take covariates that include demographics, economic, and housing-related variables from the ACS and the county business patterns. And importantly, we take the data at sort of the latest we take is 2016. So all the covariates would be pre-treatment, and we're not conditioning on post-treatment covariates. And this is like a full list. Sure.
5 more minutes.
Okay, this is like a full list of the covariates. And the results are relatively robust to inclusion of all of them or only part of them. And the methodology we use is a very standard differences in differences setup, which I'm sure everyone's very familiar with. And the estimate of interest is the average treatment effect on the treated averaged over post period, which is again very standard. And of course, the identification assumption is parallel trends, either unconditionally or conditional on the covariates. And in words, what this means is if the treated unit were not treated, then they would have the same post minus pre difference in the outcome as the untreated units. And one thing that could certainly break this is if units somehow anticipate treatment and start to behave differently. But there's a relatively short time period that could happen, right? There's only a sort of 6 months or so period after the tax cut is passed and before the zones are selected. And this provision is somewhat last minute in the tax bill in the first place. And so we think that the anticipation is not as much of a concern. So our main set of result has to do at the census tract level. We use 3 strategies. The first strategy, we follow Zillow and assume that eligible but not selected census tracts are sufficiently similar to the selected tracts for parallel trends to hold. And we use the standard two-way fixed effects estimation clustered at the state level. So the baseline without covariates estimate gives something like a 0.4 with confidence interval that narrowly rejects 0. But the pretest that tests whether there is a parallel trend violation also rejected. And so we might sort of take this estimate with a grain of salt. Comparatively, CEA runs the same design, uses a slightly different calculation of the left-hand side variable and gets 0.5. If we throw in linearly controlled covariates, then we basically get the same estimate and confidence interval, and the pretest is not rejected in this case. The second strategy is much like the first strategy, but we're going to control for covariates flexibly and explicitly use the parallel trends conditional on X assumption. We also leverage some recent work in econometrics and take either a propensity score weighting approach or a doubly robust estimation method. Both of them are very similar and they're valid and efficient when assuming conditional on X parallel trends. And both strategies indeed yield estimates that are very similar and similar to the estimates that we had in strategy 1, which is about a size of 0.3 and with a confidence interval that narrowly includes or excludes 0. And the third strategy is to match each treated unit to its nearest untreated geographical neighbor. An estimation is done essentially by taking a within pair difference, and now so you only have a single time series to work with, and then we compare the pre and post treatment of that time series. And we again produce relatively similar point estimates, although perhaps on the higher end here. And the highest level that the confidence interval would allow is about 1.1 in price impact. And the event study plot here, just to show you that 3 strategies yield relatively similar point estimates, that if you squint, you can see like a positive price effect, but you certainly wouldn't conclude that the price effect is somewhat large or definitively positive. And we're going to repeat our exercise with the zip code level estimation while redefining the treatment as being some sort of weighted average exposure to opportunity zones.
All right, 1 more minute.
The interpretation of the coefficient is now slightly different because it's now a continuous treatment variable, but the general story is we're going to find extremely similar point estimates for the zip level estimation. And lastly, for the second hypothesis of differential treatment impact, we're going to find the estimates being very similar, the estimates being in the right direction as being predicted by the hypothesis. So residential areas do seem to have less of an impact than commercial areas, but the confidence interval, once you include covariates, it does not reject 0. And so just to conclude, the point estimates for treatment effects are generally positive, but small in magnitude. And the estimates are insufficiently precise to rule out effects of 0, but sufficiently precise to rule out large positive effects of more than 1 percentage points. And the point estimates for commercial areas are indeed larger than those for residential areas, but the difference is not large enough to reject 0. Thanks.
Thanks so much. And now we'll have Fernando for
So should I stop sharing now?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you. Let me see if I can share my screen here.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Can you see my slides?
We can see it. Yes.
And can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you well.
So thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Kevin. It's great to be here, seeing everyone. I'm sorry, I'm actually a bit under the weather today. Hopefully it's not a COVID-21. So, but in my 10 minutes, this comment, let me first say it's a great paper. I really enjoyed it, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to enjoy the other papers in this section too. I have 3 brief comments. The first one is about, let me get to my marker here, welfare decomposition. The second one about the lagged house price effects. And the third one is a mix of smaller comments about research design and mechanisms. So let me start with the welfare decomposition. And I'm going to use the example of the 1990s empowerment zones, the EZ, just because I have a lot more studies, a lot more data on that. And it started in 94, $3.2 billion invested over 10 years, and 850 per neighborhood residence. And this program was really important because, it had a really large number of tax breaks and tax credits, helping with wage and block grants. It was a very different beast than the current program, but it was targeted towards jobs and investments, and it kind of worked in certain ways. I mean, take-up rates were kind of funny. Large firms benefited the most, while the local smaller firms really didn't. And then based on the work of Busso, Gregory, and Klein, we learned that, they look at, if you look at this is the main figure, main table in the paper, they look at many variables in order to estimate welfare, such as, jobs for the zone residents, inside the zone and outside the zone, jobs for non-residents, and rents and house prices. That's the last variable. And what they found is this column here, that the job effect, there are some job effects, but they're small and no effects on rents. And the largest impact by far, it's on house values. It's an order of magnitude bigger. So now I must say the facts in that paper, they're noisy because, by the virtue of the program, they had a very small number of observations. But that provides an empirical justification for mostly focusing on house prices as the most important measure of welfare. But knowing that if you really want to evaluate the whole easy policy and think about welfare, it would be nice to look at the other impacts. Now, the good news is the other papers today may touch on some of those subjects, so we'll see it happening later. Now, focus on house prices here, because that's the goal of this paper. One good thing is the effect can be potentially large. However, when Busso, Gregory, and Klein did it, they look at the impact on prices 6 years later using the decennial census, okay? And that's my second point, which is lagged price effects. Those OZ effects may show up with non-trivial lags, okay? I don't think we should assume that they will show up right in the first year, all the effects. For 2 reasons. New construction may not come online until many years after the project's proposed. And stick housing markets may respond slowly to new information. It's always tricky to figure out how the market is reacting to new information. So, 6 years from now, the situation, the estimates may be quite different. And we don't really know how COVID-19 will mitigate or magnify those impacts. It could go either way. I guess magnifying. And just to show the potential for this, this is a shameless plug of one of my old papers here about school infrastructure investments and the impact on house prices. the first year had a small effect here, 2%, but then it grows. By year like 6 or 7, that's where you have more or less the peak of the effect, because then you have all the construction happening over 3-4 years, and then you need a couple more years to people to figure out, oh, the neighborhood's changed in a certain way, and you have housing transactions. So this is just an example to show that there is potential. Whatever answer, which means the answer that you're getting right now may not be the final answer yet, unless you're willing to assume, perfect forward-looking actors and so on, which is it's hard to believe in that assumption.
5 more
That's
minutes.
my second point. Thank you. I'm going fast. Now, the third point has to do with research design and mechanisms. And I'll focus on those 3 things. I'll go really quickly. The dollars invested, change in type of investment, and the spillovers. Okay. Dollars invested is pretty simple. Is the EZ from the 90s, we had much better data because had time to collect the data. And it's still not obvious to me right now what's the magnitude of those new investments per neighborhood, per project, or local resident. And I think this type of data is critical, and it's pretty much can be a key source of variation for your econometric model. Because I believe certain neighborhoods got nothing, other neighborhoods got more. And I don't know if this data is already available. I'll learn it today with other papers. I don't know if those QFs are actually supposed to disclose this data or not. So if anyone knows it here, please let us know, because then this data should be used in it would be great if you can have that. Now, I'm also curious to, the magnitude of the benefits for the investors. That's a separate paper. We know if the EZ from the 90s, the larger firms benefit the most. I suspect the same thing is going to happen now. But again, this is a separate paper. But the magnitude of the investments per neighborhood, per project, that would be something really nice to have and being in order to be able to incorporate in your econometric framework. Now, this is the example of the Philadelphia OZs. So the OZs are in red, and there's the zoom in here of 2 neighborhoods. Fishtown is a neighborhood that should not be there. This is one of those neighborhoods, just the political process or the developers lobbied to include them. It's a gentrified neighborhood full of bars and restaurants and $1 million homes. It should not be part of the OZs, but now East Kensington is poor. It's poor, it's dilapidated, and it's old, and it was rightly so included. And here's an example of Kensington. It's full of abandoned lots and poverty and so on. And this is the planned project for that lot. And what happened with that planned project is that it changed after the OZ. It was supposed to be a 5-story, 9 duplex, 28 apartments, and now it's 105 apartments, okay, and 13 art studies as opposed to 2 commercial spaces. So I guess this is the main mechanism that you have in mind, which is you have new projects and you have bigger projects. And but it would be nice, again, I'm not sure it's feasible to get any data from the QFs about those projects and actually use in the paper. I would love to see that. And I'll leave the jobs behind because, again, other papers will talk about the jobs, but thinking about it is also critical, especially in the sense of how it impacts local residents versus the non-local residents. That's, again, related to those welfare calculations. Now, my final point here is in the same way that the OZ probably had an effect on that project in terms of increasing the number of units. I don't know, I tried to find, but I couldn't, if that same developer canceled plans in no OZ nearby tracts, okay? And that would be a type of negative spillover effect that would partially invalidate our control group. Now, there are two potential ways that I can think of solving this econometric issue, which is dealing with the spillovers. One is to find data, which is pretty much impossible. I said difficult, but it's impossible. The second one is the plan B, is to estimate an econometric specification that actually accounts for spillovers. Now, you're going to need certain assumptions for that. And should be based on measures of economic or geographic distance. The geographic distance should be the easiest one, and that's what people use. And I'm going to just draw it here. Right now, if you look at this Zoom area here in Philadelphia, the white tract here, 30 seconds, Daniel?
Okay, no problem.
Thank you. The white tract here is the one that you have the most negative spillover effects, just because developers are not developing there between Fishtown and Kingston. There's no way. But if you estimate the model on beams of distance, at certain point, there will be certain distances that will have a minimized negative spillover effect. Now, the trade-off is as you get far away from certain tracts that are most likely to be the OZ tracts, then they're less likely to be comparable. So there's a trade-off there, but you can easily estimate those models in beams. That's what I call spillover models, where you estimate, a sequence of effects. And because unfortunately, again, not unfortunately, it might be just that's the economic effect. The white tract that are too close may not be great control groups. Okay, so that's what I recommend for this. Although given the map that I'm showing Philadelphia, it may be difficult to implement in practice. So you have to see, you have to do your best. But that's my recommendation to deal with that. And I'm done with my last 30 seconds. So it's excellent work. I really enjoy reading it. So thank you.
Thank you very much to both the to presenters and to Fernando for the discussion. I want to give the authors some time to respond to the discussion. There are a number of questions, but they seem to be getting answered in the chat box in real time.
So thanks, Fernando, for all the great points that you raised. And we, on your point on the price effect might only show up after a number of years, that's certainly plausible. I guess we're just trying to do the initial analysis that at least the sort of initial impact is not as large as some people would like to claim. And on the negative spillover point, completely agree that there sort of needs to be more careful thinking on how to control that. Although I suppose that would sort of imperil the design where you compare against geographical neighbors, but for the designs that only sort of matches on baseline covariates, I suppose that would still be okay.
Yeah, thank you, Fernando. I mean, what you say, of course, makes sense. I think, in fact, the thing that makes me most sad is I really was hoping to find substantial heterogeneity based on the ability to supply new housing. That, in fact, you really do. I mean, the economics of this sort of strongly pushes you towards that. And that just didn't come in nearly as strongly as we had hoped. Of course, dealing with the tricky economics of the range of geographic spillovers is worth doing more on. I think we didn't want to give ourselves those extra degree of freedom up front, but since you've given them to us, Fernando, we'll go ahead and take them going forward. And of course, we're all hoping to be able to figure out more things as we get more years of data on this. And I do want to highlight, I agree with Fernando that it is sort of amazing that it takes multiple years for something like this to happen. And that seems to be a fact about housing markets, that, whatever interventions often show up over time. But, that's not the way it's supposed to work. Right? That is not the way that our models tell us it's supposed to happen. And so that's I just want to highlight that's a troubling fact, not something that we naturally should say, oh, it all rolls out slowly over time and be happy with that.
In my older paper, I started with the basic models. I was thinking, yeah, everything will show up in year 0, and it didn't. The models need some adaptation or some change.
Well, and your whole paper with Joe about the housing boom spreading slowly over space is not one that's compatible with instantaneous informational adjustment in housing markets.
Okay, any further questions or response? If not, I think we should move to the second paper of the session. What determines where opportunity knocks? Political affiliation in the selection of opportunity zones. And Rebecca Lester is going to present that.
Great. Can you see my slides?
I can see your slides.
Fantastic. Great. Thanks. So thanks so much to Lena and Andra for organizing this session, and really appreciate, Matt, you being willing to discuss the paper. So we're going to look at the selection of the opportunity zones and how that selection occurred, and really if there was any type of political bias in that process. So, so broadly, the paper, the broad research question is, what factors influence the selection of certain low-income communities intended to benefit from the opportunity zones incentive? And much like Kevin showed earlier in this session, this is a map where the tan areas are the areas that were eligible but not picked, and the red areas are those areas that were picked. So as a very brief overview, opportunity zones are over 8,000 low-income neighborhoods. It was passed in the TCJA. I know we've covered some of this, so I'm going to go through this quite quickly. Provides a tax benefit for investment in communities across all the 50 states. Again, this is the $75 billion number that Kevin cited that was in the CEA report. And a lot of states have state-level opportunity zones provisions that provide not just, or augment, for example, the federal benefit to also provide some state-level benefit. And this has been a very prominent policy, certainly in the Trump administration. They created this White House Opportunity and Revitalization Council to implement it. Okay, so to specifically discuss how the zones were selected, Fernando hit on this a bit in his comments. Right after the TCJA was passed, the Treasury published a list of over 42,000 eligible census tracts, which, many of us work with census tract data. We know those are neighborhoods between 2,500 and 8,000 people on average. An area was eligible if the median income was no greater than 80% of the area's median income, or if a tract had a poverty rate in excess of 20%. From that list of eligible tracts, each governor was to pick up to 25% of those as an opportunity zone. The final list was then reviewed and announced by the Treasury during May and June of 2018. And the biggest benefits accrued to investors as of the end of December 2019. So there was some, incentive on investors' part to try and invest by the end of 2019 if one was to do so. Certainly the incentive is in place longer than just through that period, but the incentives do seem to decline after that time. And so broadly, what we test or study in this paper is, how did politics affect the opportunity zone selection process? Specifically, we look at three questions. One, to what extent did governors select areas that were politically aligned? And there might be differing reasons why that would occur. One could be that there was greater information coming through politically affiliated networks, and maybe that drove a greater selection of those areas. Alternatively, this could be another way that governors would reward aligned constituencies. So then, to the extent that we find there is any role of political affiliation, we study whether any type of information that governors use, which we'll call formal information channels, if it altered the influence of that political affiliation. And then finally, and sorry, to do that, we're going to look at the type of selection processes that each governor used. And then finally, in the last part of our paper, we look at some early outcomes, primarily in the real estate industry, as you saw from the last paper and the other papers in this session, that focus a little bit on the real estate industry, and see if any of those outcomes vary based on political affiliation. Okay, so there were a lot of critiques about the opportunity zone selection process. A number of different comments talking about how, governors had incentives to pick certain areas, or certainly that lobbyists had facts, or even politically connected individuals. Even Amazon was noted for getting a tax break, basically after going to after a certain area in Virginia was identified as an opportunity zone, selecting that. And certainly their other original HQ2 location in New York is in an opportunity zone. This was such a big concern that a couple of members of Congress wrote a letter to the Treasury Secretary back in June, requesting specifically a review of the selection process. So the way that we test this in the paper is to look at, effectively all of the tracts that were eligible, and then we're going to compare, using that map I showed before, those that were selected, the red tracts, the opportunity zones, to those that were eligible and met the same type of demographic requirements but were not selected by governors. And we're going to measure whether or not an area was affiliated based on if the local representatives, so the representatives to the state, the equivalent of the state House of Representatives from that area, was of the same political party of the governor. And we're going to regress that, just an indicator if there was, an indicator if the area was selected on that, also an indicator for whether or not the local representative was of the same party, as well as a number of other demographic characteristics, including two of which were the statutory requirements, the poverty rate and median income, to see if there was variation in the extent to which already, distressed low-income communities, if those characteristics mattered even more in the selection process. So in our first set of results, we look primarily only at the demographic characteristics, and we find that on average, for example, 1 percentage point increase in, for example, the poverty rate resulted in around a 2% increase in the likelihood of selection. Similarly, we find that as income went up in an area, as median income increased, the likelihood of selection went down. And so, even though, all of the areas had to meet these low income requirements, we find on average that governors were more likely to pick areas that were even more distressed from this pool of already distressed tracts. We find on average governors were around 2% more likely to, or 2% increase in likelihood of selection based on the tract population. And then in the last, what I'm highlighting here at the bottom, skipping a couple of these other ones, is that we put in a couple of variables from the Urban Institute looking at if these areas seem to be changing in preceding periods, if they had some type of socioeconomic change or even private sector investment changes in the years preceding. And we find pretty large effects that if an area had been changing in preceding periods, they were around 40% more likely to be selected. Okay, so those are the demographic characteristics that we first study. We then include our political variable, political affiliation variable for same party. And we find that if an area was of the same political party as the governor, that there appeared to be about a 1.9 percentage point higher likelihood of selection, or around a 7.6% increase in the likelihood that an area would be picked. So on average, from answering kind of our first part of the paper, governors chose opportunity zone tracts that appeared to be poorer, more populous, already improving, some may call gentrifying, but we'll say already improving, and of the same political party as the governor. Now, in the second part of our paper, we then go and collect information on the types of information processes or the information that governors used in their selection process. And I would say this part of the paper we're in the middle of currently revising and doing a lot more work around. So what the results I'll show you here is from our original version that we posted, basically looking at these different roles of selection processes in the selection decision. So we do collect data on the process used by each state, and then we include an additional number of indicators in our specification to tease out whether these different types of information or processes affected that political affiliation in the selection process. So what we find is that for states where we can't find any evidence of any type of formal process that was used, it looks like the likelihood of picking a same party area increases up to almost 26%. And so that means that for those areas where we can't observe that, for example, the governor engaged with professional advisors or used a local economic development board, that they did not have a public comment process or use application procedures, we see that this political affiliation seems to strengthen, implying almost a substitute form of information or a different information channel. In those states where what we code as professional engagement, meaning that governors engaged either with external advisors or with someone in the state government or even local governments, we find a completely offset of that political affiliation effect. And so that effect seems to completely diminish away depending on the type of information that governors used. And then we don't seem to see much effect with an application process. Really, admittedly, an ex post argument that we have here is that perhaps it's because the application pool is biased. Maybe governors encouraged certain individuals to apply to the application process and then ended up picking those politically affiliated individuals or projects areas in the end. Okay, in the last part of our paper, we then look to see if this political affiliation is playing any role in the outcomes. And so we're trying to use this as a way to disentangle whether this political affiliation signaled a role for better information, or if it was a way to reward politically aligned constituencies.
Rebecca, you've got 4 minutes.
4 minutes, thanks so much.
5.
5, okay. And so we study the industry that was most likely to respond, which is the real estate industry. And we look at the number of commercial real estate transactions using CoreLogic data. We look at the number of new construction building permits also using CoreLogic data, and both of these are at the address level. And then we look at construction employment. And we use that at the county level, and that's just a function of the only data that are available. We also actually look at residential real estate transactions, as in the first paper that was done. We look at that kind of in the back end in our online appendix, confirming their kind of no result on average effect that they find there. But we focus more on the commercial side. We're really interested in like the business type of investment that's happening, and using that as a way to disentangle whether or not this political affiliation drove different results. And so the reason that we do this is we want to be able to say, if we have actually observed that there was greater investment in these affiliated areas, then we could potentially make some argument that maybe those actually signal better selections or something like more optimal selections. Now, that conclusion hinges on really strong assumptions. For example, that real estate investment's representative of all opportunity zone investment, and also that it would be aligned with the policy intent, both of which, as I mentioned, are strong and certainly may not hold for a number of reasons that we outline in the paper. So what we do is we actually we use a triple difference and difference strategy here, where we're going to compare, what happened in the selected areas after they were picked, and then also how that varies based on whether or not those areas were affiliated. And what I'll show you is the results for all 3 of the outcomes we look at. I'm just going to summarize these beta 1 and beta 2 coefficients for each one. So focusing on the first column here, what we see is on average, there appear to be more commercial real estate transactions in those areas that were picked, but we don't see any strong evidence that vary based on political affiliation so far, based on this really early evidence that we have. Again, to Fernando's point, this is kind of, just looking within about 18 months after it was passed. We're not seeing any strong effect of it kind of varying based on this political affiliation. And we find those same type of results if you look down the column here across all 3 of these outcomes, some positive effect, but no statistically significant negative effect, implying some difference in those politically affiliated areas. Now, our earlier part of the paper showed that indeed that political affiliation only happened in those states where basically they had, professional or where there are no processes in place. And if you look over here, I'll just skip to the far right column, actually, we don't see actually any effect happening in those states. Now, this is not saying this is any type of causal conclusion about if a process was causing these to happen, because they're just all we conclude is that they're somehow correlated with potentially what's happening in those states. So to summarize, what do we find in this paper? Well, we study what decides where opportunity knocks. We find that demographic and political affiliation seem to play a pretty important role in governor selection processes. We demonstrate the role of formal information, and that there appear to be these different information channels that play a pretty important role in either mitigating or offsetting or potentially increasing. The lack of information seems to increase the role of that political affiliation effect. And we observe early outcomes only in those states where there's no evidence of political affiliation. So we think the evidence is pretty important really for any type of future empirical evaluation of the policy. So in this session, there's 3 other papers looking at outcomes, and we think it Potentially this role of selection will come up just as it did in the discussion of the first paper, in considering any type of outcome that might happen. Certainly there's been more calls for these types of projects and a lot of current policy proposals to alter the opportunity zones incentive. I'll highlight just two prominent ones. Certainly during the Trump administration, there was a lot of talk about this policy, particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it was a pretty important piece of the platform for the Biden-Harris campaign that they talk and think about reforming opportunity zones. So we hope our analyses helps to inform what happened during the selection process and also can help with any of the future work that will be done in this space. Thank you very much. And again, thanks so much to Matt for discussing the paper. I really look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much. So Matt Friedman will discuss next.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Slides are okay?
Slides look good.
Great. Okay, thanks again, Dan, for chairing. Thanks to Elena's team for organizing this, and thanks for the opportunity to read this really great paper on the role of political affiliation in the selection and early effects of opportunity zones. So just to quickly summarize, this paper examines the importance of political affiliations in the selections of opportunity zones. They find significant same party impacts, but those effects seem to be mediated by governors' use of professional advisors, public comment periods, and other formal processes for gathering information and selecting zones. Furthermore, they look at some short-run real estate-related investment outcomes and find that the positive effects of opportunity zone designation seem to be largely concentrated in zones where political affiliations played a more limited role in selection. So this is a really cool and timely paper. Place-based policies are to some extent back on the front burner, thanks in part to work by Chetty and others emphasizing the importance of place in determining future economic outcomes. And opportunity zones pack more punch than many other programs of this ilk. I think opportunity zones are also quite interesting in that they incorporate a relatively high degree of state discretion in zone designation. And it's not so clear how introducing this discretionary component is going to impact program effectiveness relative to, say, more formulaic or rule-based design. Also, this discretionary piece, as Rebecca hinted, and as many other papers in this session have kind of dealt with in various ways, kind of presents particular empirical challenges, given that it injects some uncertainty, but unfortunately not randomness, into which tracks were chosen and why. So I just had a couple of comments about the empirical strategy and interpretation. So first, on disentangling kind of same party effects from other tract characteristics. So the current approach in the paper is to show that a set of demographic characteristics goes some way towards explaining opportunity zone designation, and then to show that the sort of same party affiliation of the state legislative representative has some explanatory power over and above these demographic controls. I guess in light of the overarching question of the paper, I might have been tempted to take the opposite approach. That is to say, first estimate a raw same party effect, and then show how much conditioning on what might be these kind of core demographic characteristics or information that governors might have leaned on, how much that attenuates or amplifies the relationship. And then given what I kind of view as maybe a natural concern about omitted variable bias here, you could then kind of go on to further saturate the model to see if and how you can that the same party effect changes, right? Or if it dies when you saturate the model further. So I think particularly worthwhile maybe in this context is actually to try like city or county fixed effects, in part because, and I may be wrong, but my impression is that at least some governors might have leveraged opportunity zones to support much broader economic development goals centered for perhaps on certain parts of their states. And if that's the case, maybe a stronger test of your hypothesis might be to look within cities or counties in which there's heterogeneity and political affiliation of state legislators across tracks. There's kind of another concern that arises here, and that is that sequentially adding controls and then asking how those controls change coefficients of interest. That can be problematic in this kind of context where covariates are all intercorrelated. So I think this might be a nice candidate actually for a kind of a Gelbach style decomposition, that allows you to account for the effects on the same party coefficient of adding covariates in a way that that's not sensitive to the order in which you add the covariates. So next, I think that the paper would benefit a lot, or at least I would have benefited a lot from hearing more about why some governors and states actually undertook more formal review processes, including, again, things like professional advising and public comment periods and so on, to designate opportunity zones. That is to say, I think it might be nice to have a little bit more detail, about which states had these formal review processes and didn't, and if it's possible to know why they actually adopted, formal review processes if they did. So I think this discussion might speak to whether or not there could be other underlying differences among states that could be kind of confounding the estimated heterogeneous effects that you observe across states with different OZ selection procedures. Or maybe a better spin to this would be that it could point to some alternative mechanisms behind the differential effects on investment that you observe for zones.
You have 5 more minutes.
Okay, no problem. So I also think that this kind of discussion of where formal review processes were and were not adopted, and therefore where kind of political favoritism seemed to be more or less severe, might allow you to connect to a much broader political economy literature, addressing the conditions under which decentralization, like the decentralization that's happening under this program, might improve efficiency and accountability versus kind of impede coordination and perhaps even facilitate corruption or more rent-seeking type behavior. So turning to interpretation, I think, and you know this, but a knee-jerk reaction to this paper, of course, is to question whether or not there should be a kind of discretionary component to OZ designation at all. But we're kind of in this unfortunate situation in which we can't really compare or contrast empirically here to a world with no discretionary component. That is to say, more like an empowerment zone world where the federal government just said this is how it is, and that's what went, as opposed to one where the states got to make their own choices. And so it's impossible to know whether or not kind of a more formulaic design or a more centralized design, like we saw, for example, with the New Markets tax credit, might have worked better. And similarly, we can't know whether or not leveraging political affiliation is in fact worse than only using a small set of demographic controls and nothing else. So I at the end of the paper was kind of left scratching my head as to what to do, if anything, about this, and wondered whether or not that was just something you would be willing to go out on a limb and kind of speak more about in the paper as well. So finally, at the end of the day, I guess I was also left wondering, how big a deal is this? Is this something we should really be worried about or not? This political favoritism that we seem to observe. On the one hand, only 5 states containing 14% of eligible tracts use no formal review process, at least that we're aware of. And so perhaps we should be heartened that the vast majority of designations occurred kind of outside the shadow of political influence, and that on net, these effects on investment activity that you observe are positive. And so maybe that makes you wonder perhaps whether the limited political favoritism you've identified here is maybe a small price to pay for the benefits that came with allowing for some local control. But on the other hand, what we see in this paper might in fact just be the tip of the iceberg, right? So beyond the potential favoritism towards state legislators that you examine, there's obviously other groups that governors might want to cater to with this program. Mayors, of course, perhaps developers, maybe donors more generally, maybe voters, and so on. And so it makes me wonder whether or not by focusing on favoritism just towards state legislators, we might in fact be missing or obscuring favoritism towards other groups, that it could in fact be much more severe and problematic. So that's all the comments I have. This is a really great paper on a kind of a relatively high-powered place-based policy. I think it potentially has really important implications for program design and implementation. And as Rebecca said, it also has really critical implications for other empirical work that's looking at some sort of downstream outcomes of this program. So thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot, Matt. I wanted to give Rebecca or any of her co-authors a chance to respond to the discussion, and after that I'll read out any Q&A questions in the Q&A box that have not been answered. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Matt. Thank you very much for these comments. These are really helpful. Let me just comment on a couple of them. On the processes, we've actually been spending quite a bit of time trying to dig into those a little bit more. We also think that there is some opportunity there. Sorry, I don't mean to make a pun with it, but there is a place to try and understand those more and to see if it really is something that can inform not just this policy, but a broader work on political economy. And so really appreciate your comments and suggestions on that and speaking to whether this is improving efficiency to have decentralization or not. And I think really kind of the end question is what we're trying to get to with the outcomes is like, did this help or not? Exactly to your question on like, should we be improving discretionary components or not? Or having this discretionary component, and that's where we are trying to get to. And we just don't know if the evidence is just too early to make some conclusions about it, but we'll certainly give a lot more thought to that. And I think there's one, I don't know if there's other questions. I see one, I haven't read it yet, had a chance to read it yet, but can address that question, Daniel, if you think that's the right next step.
Yeah, okay, so Jefferson Duarte asks, in our experience using the same sample, we found that the relation between same party and OZ designation goes away when controlling for county population and clustering at the state level. Relatedly, the results go away when including county fixed effects despite substantial variation in same party affiliation within county. Do you have an explanation for this?
Well, we haven't done that task, so I haven't seen it to think about what an explanation could be here. I know that we've done all of our results clustering at the state level as well, and we still find them. We are controlling for census tract population. And so we really try to think about like what was the population of that area. But I think Matt also had some great suggestions about thinking within county or within city. And it sounds like maybe Jefferson is thinking about some of those or has thought about some of those. So actually would love to understand that. If that is what happens with the result, would love to understand that a bit more. And then hopefully I can have a better explanation or at least be able to discuss it more.
Another. Oh, go ahead.
Can I just make a comment? So I enjoyed this a great deal. I do think it's interesting to ask what the counterfactual really is, because there's never been a place-based policy that's actually been purged of politics. And in some sense, the question is whether or not you want your politics to be done at the State House or in Washington. And it's very hard to know that. But I still think what you're doing is really important. I do want to just call out a form of discretion which just dwarfs this. And I just had that running around in my mind throughout all of this, which is the Paycheck Protection Program, in which, in the first phase of it, $350 billion was given not to governors, but to individual banks to allocate to whatever company they thought was the right one to get. And of course, that went to borrowers who had been less affected by COVID during the first round. That went to borrowers who had large accounts and large debts to the bank rather than ones who were shorter. So this is important to document, but in the grand scheme of allocation and mischief that comes from discretion, it doesn't necessarily feel like it's that extreme a case.
Yeah, thank you very much for the comment. And the PPP certainly has been a really interesting policy to observe and to watch play out here. I mean, I think we approached the paper, to your first point, not expecting there to be zero, but trying to say, can we quantify it here? And actually, because there was so much discussion and has been so much critique about it, can we approach it and try to at least quantify and put some magnitude?
Absolutely, and understanding where it was larger and where it was less.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a critical point of information gathering. Absolutely.
Great. So thank you so much for the comments. Thanks to everyone. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Any further questions? Okay, I think, thank you very much to both Rebecca and Matt for the presentation and discussion. And next we will turn to the third paper, where is the opportunity in opportunity zones? Of the opportunity zone program's impact on commercial property prices, and it's being presented by Alex Van de Min.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. I see a lot of friends in chat, so it's nice to see you again, sort of. My co-author, Mike Lange, and he's actually in the chat, so if you have questions, you can actually ask them there. I don't think Alan is here. Alan Sage, he actually was a student of mine. He initiated it, but he he went to work for Goldman Sachs. So they're not so happy with this research for obvious reasons. So I don't think he's going to show up. Anyways, yeah, this is the newest version of our paper. I also want to apologize to my discussant because this is pretty late, this version. The first version I think we had was early 2019, and we were pretty early. I think we were one of the earliest. It was on SSRM, but we wanted to wait, and I'll get back in a little bit why we wanted to wait, because actually there's some ramifications there. So, I mean, the good thing, I have a bit too many slides, but on the other hand, I think a lot of these things have already been discussed. So I think I can skip a lot of it, or at least go through it very quickly. Again, ask in chat if there's still something unclear. Again, was part of the Incomes and Jobs Act, was initiated, designated early 2018, not all at the same time, which is actually pretty important. I don't think I've heard people discuss that, but there were some differences in timing on what areas got designated or not, dependent on the state. And essentially what happens is different from the, what's it called, the 1061, where you can sort of defer capital gains in real estate. Here you can defer any capital gains from any source of income up until 26. And you get a 50% discount anyway, even if you have to pay those capital gains. But then it has to be made, investment had to be made before 2019. Otherwise, you still get a discount, but it's less. It's very complex. It's in the paper in case you really want to delve into it. And also, essentially, you don't have to pay any capital gains on the property itself if you make capital gains. So those are sort of the benefits you get. And then how do you get these guys, these benefits? You should also already know this. First of all, you simply need to buy commercial real estate. But with real estate, I mean, or in property throughout this presentation, by the way, I mean in a broader sense. This can also be vacant lands. But yeah, first step, you have to buy in this designated area, which makes sense, right? But the other step is that you have to spend as much on CapEx as you did on purchasing the property. CapEx standing for capital expenditures, if you've never heard of it. So this can be development, redevelopment, or even renovations. It can be anything. As long as you put money in these properties, again, can also be vacant land. As long as you throw money at it, that is as much as the purchase price, then you're good to go. And that's how you qualify. Sorry, there's a lot of text here, but it is kind of important. What is the basic question that we asked ourselves? I think the basic question is sort of this third subline over here, is basically asking, okay, what is happening? Is this tax just a pass through to existing landowners, or is there some value added created? I already want to be quite upfront here with you guys. And this is, of course, if you really wanted to know if this program worked or not, you have to redo the study in 10 years, right? Because we don't know yet. We don't know because it's going on as we're talking. So what we're talking about is expectations. And we're talking about expectations of commercial real estate investors. And for us, the idea is different from housing, where you might buy because you're moving there, because you got a job there or something. No, these are investors and they can choose to invest somewhere or not, right? And basically the question is like, is this just a tax pass through to these existing landowners? Is a value creation, et cetera, et cetera. We look at prices and liquidity. First of all, of course, with prices, you would think that if the rents will grow in the future, that would be priced in now. I'm going to show the DCF in a little bit, but I hope you guys know the DCF or the ASSA. So any future price growth should be priced in now. And I think here's sort of part of the key takeaway is that, for example, we argue that very young properties, they cannot benefit from the direct tax benefit that we talked about earlier, right? Because you need to do this huge amount of CapEx spending. So we're basically arguing that, look, these very young properties, you cannot enjoy any benefit from this tax directly, right? So we argue that, okay, if prices go up also for very young properties, so properties that were just built like a few years ago, just before this designation started, if we even find a price increase there, then we argue that those investors, they actually believe that future prices or future rent goes up. So that means there's some sort of gentrification going on in the area. Again, it's an expectation, right? And we should expect that to happen immediately. Although I'll get back in a little bit that this immediate thing, don't take it too literal, because there's also reasons to believe that it's not too immediate. But again, I'll get back at that. But we also therefore analyze sort of the opposite side of it, which is vacant land. And we look at very old properties where we argue it's a lot easier to do a lot of CapEx spending on those guys and see if price increases there. And for us, that is sort of the smoking gun, right? If prices go up for these old properties and for vacant land, but it doesn't for these young properties, then you can make a case. You still have to be careful, but you can make sort of a case that it's just a tax pass through and the existing landowners become wealthier and wealthier. We also look at liquidity. Why do we look at liquidity? There's actually two reasons for it. First of all, for example, with vacant land, let's say prices do not go up with vacant land. Can you then say it's a success or not? Well, if actually the ideal situation, I think, would be if prices more or less stay flat. They can go up a little bit, but not too much. But actually liquidity goes up a lot. What that would indicate is that all of a sudden a lot of negative NPV projects become positive NPV. In other words, there's a lot of development going on without prices going up. And it means that a lot of the money must go, because where does the tax break then go to? It must go to the structures. It must mean, you know, with the absence of CapEx spending, you can sort of infer it must go into better buildings being made and more buildings being made. And the second reason is, of course, we know that liquidity leads prices in real estate. This has to do with the process of tâtonnement by Walras, you know, where there's this disequilibrium that has to be cleared, especially in real estate where information can be slow, sluggish. And then what happens is demand increases, but the guys owning the real estate, they don't notice this immediately. And then all of a sudden they see that they sell a lot and then they adjust the price, right? So there's also, because it's such a short project, right? It just happened recently. There's reason to believe that maybe it's not reflected in prices yet, but it is already in liquidity. And then, you know, you can sort of make a puzzle on what's, you know, what's going on there. So those are the two things we look at. We look young, old, vacant land, and we look at prices, liquidity. So first of all, quickly about the tax benefit. So the top line is what would happen in a non-opportunity zone. Like what would the investment value be? So these are after-tax cash flows, after-tax discount rates. And, you know, you would sum the cash flows, right? We've done this, I hope, 1 million times. And then we have a terminal value or exit value. So we sell it for something, you know, we've also done that. And you discount it with the period when you sell it, T. And then what you subtract from it, because here I assume you purchase this property with capital gains made somewhere else, is you have to pay a tax on those initial capital gains you made. So you finance it completely through your own capital gains. Times X, which is the tax rate, which is sort of a blended tax rate. And then, of course, you also have your capital gains over here, which is your exit value minus the book value times the tax rate and also discounted, right? This is what happens in a non-opportunity zone. So what happens in the opportunity zone is, first of all, this guy goes away immediately because you almost pay no capital gains tax as well. So this guy, we can say goodbye. And this guy is slightly different because first of all, we get the 15% discount. And second of all, we can wait, you know, when we want to pay this tax. And then what you can do, if you assume that this terminal value is like the initial investment times some sort of constant growth term of the capital gains. So this capital gains, not NOI growth per se, this is sort of everything included. Then you can rewrite it. You can see in the paper how, I won't do it here, but you can rewrite it into this formula over here. And this is sort of the difference between an opportunity zone and another opportunity zone. You can do, you can sort of plug in values that are realistic because, sorry, there's this bar in front of it, so I can't see it myself. But anyways, the T is typically put on 10 years. Anyways, the capital T, I mean, because that's the typical pro forma in real estate. And the small TI, we're just going to say, look, they're going to wait until the final moment when they pay this, right? So that's also not really an input. So TI is just 6 years because you're going to try to you know, wait paying taxes as long as you can. So that means that the only real variables that you're interested in is the growth rate and this after-tax discount rate. And if you sample those guys, you get like a theoretical benefit of the you know, of these investments that lies somewhere within this cloud. We settled in the end on this number, I think over here, 16%. By the way, it's also interesting, maybe I should mention first, is that the discount rate actually doesn't matter that much. We're sort of surprised. Look at here, if we go look further vertically, there's almost no difference, except when you go to the very extremes, but even then, it's not so different. It mostly depends on this growth rate of your capital. We were sort of surprised by it. So we picked 4%, which is consistent with sort of previous, you know, previous growth rates. And we ended up somewhere here with 16%, which we're going to use later as a benchmark to see what is the price effect that we're finding, right? This is the maximum benefit if all the money would go to the landowner. That's sort of what I'm trying to say. So we can benchmark these back of the envelope with the numbers we're actually finding. So the methodology, sorry, also a lot of text, but you do know the most important thing is that of all the eligible census tracts, about 25% was picked to be designated, right? So we use this as a different setup. I think it's very similar with other people. We do propensity score match the census tracts first, and we actually find this is hugely important because it doesn't seem like it was a completely random process, this process of making it eligible. So this actually has a big influence if you look at the pro and after matching on some of the on what census tracts are in there. We also look at only a relatively tight bound around the treatment. So we only look at 2018, 18, 19. That's actually different from our study before where we looked at the entire history and then only until the end of 2018. But, you know, especially to alleviate concerns of non-parallel trends, we want to look closely at this treatment. And yeah, so in the other things we do, we break it up in different groups. Sorry, 5 minutes?
5 minutes, thanks.
So we break the sample up in different age groups and we do a rolling regression. I'm not going to show all the results, don't worry. And then we can sort of piece together sort of what's going on here. So the basic specification here is just price. We have county, by the way, it's transaction data that we have. So it's on the property level. So we have sort of the prices here, and then we have county times year fixed effects. Then we have some property characteristics. Then this data is a sort of a fixed effect for just the opportunity zones within the county, whether it's before or after designation. And this is then the treatment effect. And this actually is interesting because even after propensity score matching, we still find that this is negative and significant. I'm not going to show these results, but it really means that, yeah, these designated zones were really less valuable than actually the eligible zones, even after matching, which is kind of surprising. We do the same for the liquidity, but maybe it's a short explanation of what we mean with liquidity. What we do is we look at the probability to sell model. So we make a full panel of the full population of properties out there. So also the properties that didn't even sell in 2017, 18, or 19, we make a full panel and we give it a 1 when it got sold in a specific quarter. So it's a full panel of quarterly data. So most of the X variables will be exactly the same, except for age, but like the size doesn't change, etc. And then the only other thing that changes is whether or not you got sold in that period or not. And this sort of tells us in this specification whether liquidity increased. Well, this one we know by now, I'm going to skip it. We have slightly different colors. This is the one I meant earlier. So if we look at the average median income in these eligible zones and the average poverty rate, you can see if we compare it with the opportunity zones, so the ones that in the end got designated, there's a pretty big difference, I would argue. You can see poverty rates a lot higher, income is a lot lower. I wouldn't say it's statistical, but at least it's considerable, right? And then after matching, it's a lot more samey, right? We also do the matching, by the way, within a region. So we sort of pick one-on-one matching within a region. So we're not matching New York with California. I'm going to skip the transaction data. It's data from Real Capital Analytics. You can see it in the paper. Maybe you've worked with the data yourself. It's both on the prices, probability to sell. This is a couple of Meyer estimate of heavy CapEx spending over age. We can sort of see that we broke it up in 3 groups. Young properties are younger than 30 years. Between 30 and 80, we call middle-aged. And then over 80, it's the old properties that are up for CapEx. This is a vacant land. Again, I'm not going to go through it. So this is the important part, the results. And what I want to highlight, because we have a lot of results, is if we indeed look at the new properties over here, the second column, we see no significant effect. This is only the OC designation. For here, we see no significant effect, but we do see it for the old properties. And then we also have reason to believe that the effect wasn't immediate. Why is because the rules weren't completely ironed out at first. And as you know, just making deals in real estate can take just a very long time. So there's reason to believe that maybe the effect wasn't immediate. So what we do is we also do an OZ designation times a trend, like a post-treatment trend, or we just break it up into semi-annual dummies. That's what we do over here. Of course, we also have all the other controls like, the size of the property and stuff, but I'm not going to show that. Now we can see actually the effect is a lot larger, especially for this model. But also over here, and what's interesting here, you can see that indeed the effect wasn't immediate. The effect took a little bit and then it went away. And there's also reason to believe why the effect will go away, because a lot of the tax benefits go away if you wait too long with investing in these areas. This is for the liquidity. We can also, 1 minute, okay.
1 minute.
Yeah, we can see that liquidity initially went down. This also makes sense because people are still scrambling, thinking, okay, what's going on? You know, what are we doing? And then actually it went up. We can see it also with this model and this model, where liquidity was low and then went back up. And actually, you know, even for new properties, and this is sort of interesting, by now it's actually up. So more new, so this might actually indicate, but we could redo the test in, you know, in later years, that actually maybe they do think there's a slight effect, positive gentrification effect. This for vacant land, we see higher estimates over here. It's something like, you know, 40, 50%, because it's in lots, right? We also can see a huge increase in liquidity in vacant land. So the final slide is, you remember the 16% I said earlier, but that was of course of the sort of the total property value at the end. But when you buy it, it's worth like half of that because you still have to do the CapEx spending, right? So if you assume that they spend as much on the property as what they bought it for, that meant that the total effect should be on the like when you buy it up front, should be 32%. And the highest estimate we find is 21%. Likewise, if you assume an average land value fraction of 20%, meaning you have to put 5 times the amount of money in the property to develop the land, then you find a maximum theoretical benefit of 80%, and our highest estimate is 53%. Also, we find this a bit more liquidity for newer properties. We do find a lot of liquidity for vacant land. So the problem is now, what does this tell us? Like our initial question, is this a tax pass through or is this actually creating value? So of course, this is a bit back of the envelope, the 32 and 80%. But what this to me indicates is that most of it is still a pass tax through, but not all. There's some value created. There's some negative NPV projects that are positive now, especially if you look at the vacant land sales. So, you know, but we can also see that, you know, we're getting awfully close sometimes to the theoretical max tax benefit. So the answer, unfortunately, is not as black as white. It's somewhere in between.
Thank you very much. Crocker Lou is going to discuss the paper now.
I want to thank Andra, Elena, and Wolf for putting together the session and having invited me as a discussion. When I first looked at the first version of the paper, I thought that the authors were being very opportunistic. It's a little too early to call whether or not prices have increased or not. And then it got complicated, as Alex had put forth, that I got a second version of their paper and had to trash half my comments. And so these are new comments because I got it 3 days ago. And so they took care of a lot of the concerns that I had. But I wanted to make 4 comments on their paper. One is basically circumstantial evidence. And so there's no, casual empiricism. It's not rigorous, but basically there was a CoStar newsletter that said that they found that there's an average mean reversion for multifamily and hotel properties, as well as vacant land, which they also show in their second version of their paper that there is a effect for vacant land, but they don't really show it for multifamily and hotels. So, there's also the fact that not all property types are behaving in the same manner. For industrial property and office property, you don't have this mean reversion that is occurring. So why the difference between what Alex and his co-authors found and what CoStar is kind of suggesting is out there? And for the data set they use, RUCAP Analytics, Bob's White's data is a very good data source, but it focuses on large institutional grade properties. And there's a possibility that there's a more pronounced positive price impact for the smaller non-institutional grade properties. And so one of the reasons that the authors give for why I look at RUCAP Analytics is because institutional investors are putting together these funds. And so I'd like to push back a little and say that institutional investing is not the same as investing in institutional grade properties. That institutional investors frequently do purchase non-institutional grade properties to get a lot more juice to the transactions. And so they might want to also complement the real capital analytics data with Gold Star data or CoreLogic data to look at smaller transactions. The second comment is in their empirical strategy, where they use a propensity score matching, and that's I found that to be very desirable. But what I would also kind of like to see is take a look at the neighborhood just adjacent to the opportunity zone. And the reason for this is, suppose that I have a neighborhood right next to the opportunity zone that is a high growth area. It's making a ton of profit, but the fact is that supply is constrained. And so because supply is constrained, I would suspect that there'd be positive spillover effects into the opportunity zone. Where can we get this information for residential? It's more available than for commercial. I have some sites for where you can get it for residential, but for commercial, there's a paper by David Lin, who actually kind of demarcates in which cities supply is constrained and for what property types. And so what I thought is perhaps the border discontinuity design in the flavor of Black's QGE paper might kind of be another way to see whether or not you can compare one zone to another zone. The third has to do with the fact that not all opportunity zones are undervalued and desirable. So Alex had pointed out that CapEx has to be equal to or greater than purchase price. So in order to make a profit, it has to be the case that the sale price has to be greater than 2 times the purchase price. So where does the undervaluation exist? Well, in my earlier comment, I had suggested that they look at redevelopment, but that went out the window because Alex showed that in his newer version of the paper, redevelopment occurs. However, it's still not clear to me the reason for the redevelopment, because in the RCA data, sometimes it doesn't say there's the redevelopment, is the value coming about because you're keeping the land use the same from hotel, you're renovating into a hotel, or is it adaptive reuse where you're changing the use from a hotel into a office building or a senior living facility? And so if you're comparing using even a propensity score matching, am I comparing apples to apples? But there's other ways to look for undervaluation. One is to purchase the property below replacement costs. So we're looking at distressed property, tax liens. Also, it's kind of like vacant land, but it's value add property. So you have this large shopping center that has excess land. And so you can add additional building to this shopping center in the way of pads for a fast food restaurant or a bank. But even if
minutes left.
Okay, but even if undervaluation is occurred, it's still not clear whether the area is desirable or not. So I'm not sure whether they've considered deterrence to investments such as crime, whether there's a lot of out-migration, not only in the opportunity zone, but also in the area adjacent to the opportunity zone. And my last comment has to deal with considering an alternative to sale. We know that for the opportunity zone benefits to occur, you must hold the property for 10 years to realize no capital gain taxes. And they have recognized that 1031 exchanges are like these opportunity zone benefits. But the one thing that you might want to consider is looking at transactions where you have cash out refinancings. And the good news is that Real Capital Analytics has the data on cash out refinancings. Is you refinance a property, as soon as you get it, right, you can take the money out of the property and guess what? You don't pay any taxes on it. So I can game the system in a certain way by taking my money out as soon as I see the price appreciation. And so it kind of is a way workaround So I would suggest also looking at these types of transactions as well. And last comment is that even though you don't observe CapEx directly, you may want to consider using the building permit, the value in the building permit, because that's a noisy guesstimate of the anticipated CapEx. So that's my comments.
Okay, thank you so much for the presentation and the discussion. So there's one open comment in the Q&A chat. It's Dan Mahoney says, given the overall size of the program and the high number of tracks, there's good reason to believe that many OZ tracks aren't receiving any investment at all. And it seems likely to me that your effects are potentially a mix of a bigger effect in some tracks and no effects in other tracks. Have you done any analysis that looks only at some subset of tracks that have received some investment based on publicly available data? So I want to give you a chance to respond both to the discussion and to this question.
Sure, I can start with the latter. Yes, we did. Actually, this does correspond also with one remark from Crocker that looking at supply constraints. In all honesty, we didn't really find anything. I'm not sure why. We did break it up, the data, and looking at only the big cities versus the non-big cities. And most of the time it didn't really work. We got weird results. And we already have so many results. That was with the older paper. I can check it again, but I can remember that we weren't very happy with that. I also think it's just very difficult, like what can actually happen in these areas. And you're right, sometimes you do find slightly higher, sometimes a negative effect. Maybe it's also just not enough data because we have all those county times year fixed effects. So maybe it's the degrees of freedom, too much noise. I'm not sure. So we have looked at it in the previous version and it just simply didn't work. That's sort of the main answer. To quickly come back to the discussant's remarks. Also one of those things is we did look only at adjacent opportunity zones. Then we also, that actually did work, but we found that that it was actually very difficult because you'd think there's so many designated census tracts, but we actually found that it's not that common that they're right next to each other. And we lost like a lot of data if we simply did that. And also sometimes we found that those census tracts right next to it could be very wealthy census tracts, for example. So in our case, we just like these results better, where we just say, look, now the income is matched within a region and the income levels of those census tracts are completely similar. Mind you, it's commercial real estate investment. So I don't think it's as important as it is with housing, right? The way they make these allocation strategies. So yeah, we did try, we tried as much as we could. It's already a pretty lengthy paper, but again, it was with the older version. We can check it again. I do want to make one bigger comment here about the RCA data, because one of the things I don't like, and they do this themselves, is they call this data for institutional investors, right? That's how they sell it. But we have a very specific mind on what is institutional investors. If you actually look at their data, yeah, no, it doesn't include the mom and pop stores, but it includes the full population of all the properties above $2 million, which I don't think is actually that much. It's not something I would relate to like a huge pension fund, buying a $2 million property. So in that sense, and the good news about the RCA data is, first of all, it's the full population. That's what we really needed with the probability to sell. And of course, also just really good data, right? It's the only data I trust. There are some issues with CoStars. We know, it make a lot of false observations. CoreLogic is mostly just permit data. So there's not such a rich set, although I have to admit, I've never worked with that data. So, but in general, I just want to say RCA data is not just like the $80 million properties. They have a lot of properties and they have the full population of it. So I'm also not sure if I'm allowed to merge the data sets with CoStar. I think I might get into trouble there if you want to get the nationwide coverage. It's also a bit of I don't know, what can you do? The point about refinancings, that's super interesting. And we're definitely going to have a look at that. I'm not sure if it's going to fit in this paper, but it's definitely well taken. And I don't think we've thought about that at all before. And we do have all the refinance data. So it would be interesting to see if something is happening there. So yeah, I thank you, by the way, for doing this so last minute. But yeah.
Any other questions from the participants? Okay, in that case, next we're going to have Alina Arefeva presenting job growth from opportunity zones. Take it away.
This is joined with Morris Davis, Andra again, and Mitsuan Park. And from all of us, thank you very much for your contribution to the discussion in this section. So we are studying job growth from opportunity zones, which was the intended goal of the policy. So what we're trying to figure out is whether the policy actually affected its intended outcome. What we show is that using this same difference in difference strategy, that the program increased employment and establishment growth in targeted tracts by 3 to 4.6 percentage points. And it did so by encouraging entry of new establishments, with the largest effects in construction industries. And this growth is broad-based across industries of different skill levels. And we see that there could be some positive spillovers to nearby tracts. So I'm gonna take advantage of fantastic presentations of previous speakers and skip right to our data. So our main data set is Your Economy time series, which is establishment level employment that covers all US public and private establishments. And in this, this data is pretty similar to standard like BLS Net's data sets, but unfortunately doesn't cover locations of workers who work at these establishments. And finally, we do our analysis on the tract level. To get to our tract level data set, we sum employment and count the number of establishments in the tract to get to our estimation. And we use same supplementary data sets, so Urban Institute, a list of tracts, and also American Community Survey. So here are means for tracts that were designated in the right column, and means for tracts that were eligible but not designated in the left column. So this is before the start of the policy. From here, you can see that before the start of the policy, employment was higher in opportunity zones, and employment growth was actually lower in opportunity zones. And also, if we look at other characteristics of these census tracts, we can see that the groups differ in terms of characteristics. So how do we make sure that the pre-trends are still pretty similar? First of all, we look at a simple pre-trends graph where on the x-axis you can see 2-year growth periods. For example, 2019 is growth from 2017 to 2019. And on y-axis, we have employment growth. The 2 lines correspond to designated tracts. So this is the red line, and the tracts that were eligible but not designated is shown in this dashed blue line. So in this simple pre-trends graph, we can see that pre-trends were pretty similar. But just to make sure, we do this additional exercise where we estimate our model on the data before the start of the policy. Specifically, we regress 2-year growth in employment or number of establishments on prior growth, on ACS controls, and also we include or don't include designation dummy. And what we do is forecast the growth both in sample before the policy and also predict out of sample after the policy changed. And the graph will show the actual growth less the predicted growth. So here are 2 graphs. The left one doesn't include designation dummy, and the right one includes designation dummy. The only difference really is that on the right, you can see that average errors are close to 0. So we can see on both graphs that before the start of the policy, there was no clear defined trend. And if we predict post-tax legislation change, the tracks that were designated actually experienced higher establishment growth than predicted by our simple model. And we do the same thing for employment growth. And see here you can see there was, if anything, there was a slight trend, upward trend in tracts that were eligible but not designated. But other than that, we see a similar picture that the actual employment growth, less predicted employment growth, is higher for designated tracts. And actually, like if you look at the right graph, the difference is about 4.5 percentage points. And it's similar to the estimates that we will get from our main regressions. And we have pretty similar research design as other papers in this session. So for each tract, we regress 2-year growth in employment or number of establishments on post-dummy, treatment dummy, and their interaction. We also control for census tract characteristics. And the key is the estimate on the interaction term that will show us the estimate of the impact of the program. And in our main data set, we see some outliers. So we will prefer specifications that can deal with those outliers, such as regression to the median, or if we use OLS, we will vectorize the dependent variable at 1%. Let me actually skip to our main results. So here, what we do is we actually divide all tracts into urban tracts, so tracts that are in metro areas, and rural tracts loosely that are outside of metro areas. And here in columns 1 and 2, we present our results from run-in and regression to the median in column 1, and OLS with benzorized dependent variable at 1% in column 2, and same for tracts outside of metro areas. So you can see that the estimate on the interaction term is insignificant for tracts in rural areas. And it is positive and significant for tracts in urban areas, and is somewhere between 3 to 4.6 percentage points. So these numbers will be our benchmark estimates. So the policy increased employment growth from 3 to 4.6 percentage points in tracts located in metro areas. And we do some robustness tests, including placebo tests, dividing tracts into tracts that were eligible because they were low-income communities, or tracts that were eligible because they're contiguous communities. And we also control for a political affiliation variable that Rebecca just talked about. And it seems like we pass most of these robustness tests, and they don't really affect our results. So now that we established that the program creates a robust positive employment growth, we want to understand how exactly the program does create that growth. So first question is whether the program encourages growth in existing establishments through intensive margin, or in new establishments through extensive margin. And we use different definitions of existing establishments, but no matter which definition we use, we see that the impact of the program is insignificant for existing establishments. So what we conclude is that the creation of new establishments, so the extensive margin, is what's driving this positive employment growth. Now, how the policy is actually impacting different industries and workers of different skill levels. To answer this question, we start with classification from Mian Sufi, who divide all industries into 4 categories. First is construction. That includes development firms, real estate firms, pure construction, non-tradables. That includes restaurants and retail. And then tradables that have a big share of imports and exports. And others includes everything else that didn't fit into the previous 3 categories. The figure itself shows the estimate of the impact of the program. So the left two bars are benchmark estimates. So 4.6 percentage points for employment growth and 4.6 percentage points, 4.2 percentage points for establishment growth. And then the right bars show our estimates for a subsample of industries within that industry type. So we can see that the biggest impact of the policy is for industries within construction category. However, the program also impacted other industries as well. So even if we completely exclude construction from our sample, the estimates are still positive and significant for other industries. Now, policymakers were concerned that the policy will create employment only for high-skilled workers. So to test this, we will also divide the sample by average educational level of labor used in the industry. So we'll do 2 parts and also quantiles. So here results for this heterogeneity. Again, the left bars are benchmark estimates, and the other bars correspond to dividing the sample into 2 parts or 5 parts. And
5 more minutes.
Thank you. So just looking at overall at the picture, we can see that the employment growth is broad-based across industries with different skill levels. And if anything, the biggest impact was for industries with median skill level of education. So now the big question is whether the program actually created employment within those tracts rather than simply shifted employment from nearby tracts to designated tracts. Or alternatively, it is possible that the program created positive spillovers to nearby tracts through some sort of agglomeration externalities. So to test this, we expand our sample from all eligible tracts to also include tracts that are contiguous to eligible tracts, then contiguous to contiguous tracts, and so forth up to 4 levels of contiguity, where we almost cover all tracts in the US. And we create dummies for those contiguous categories to see what was the effect on nearby tracts. So here in column 1, the first highlighted number 4.5 shows our baseline estimate. So this is the impact, the estimate of the impact on employment for designated tracts. And then let me shift your attention to column 2, where we can see that for the contiguous tracts, the net effect is about 2 percentage points. And similarly for tracts that are contiguous to contiguous tracts. However, the spillover effect dies off when we go to 3rd and 4th levels of contiguity. So let me conclude. So what we're arguing is that opportunity zone legislation increased employment and establishment growth by 3 to 4.6 percentage points in those census tracts that are located in metro areas. And it did so by encouraging entry of new establishments, with the largest effect of the policy seen in construction industries. And the effect that we're seeing is broad-based across industries with different skill levels. And it seems like the policy also created positive spillovers to nearby tracts. And I'm not talking about it here, but I'm sure there would be more papers on opportunity zones. What is interesting is whether the program is a cost-effective way of creating employment relative to other employment creation programs. And given our finding that the program created most effect in construction industries, is this effect of this policy temporary or permanent? Perfect. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, we have Anthony DeFusco, who's going to discuss.
Awesome. Just a second. Can you see? Oh, I think I lost my slides. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, so thanks, Dan, for inviting me to discuss, and it's great to get the chance to read this paper and also consume the other 3 papers in the session. Okay, so context, everybody's described opportunity zones like 10 times now, so I won't get into it too much. It's a tax credit, basically a kind of a geographically targeted capital gains tax cut. One thing that hasn't been touched on too much that I'll touch on a little bit in the discussion is that the way that this investment works is that it's intermediated through what's called a qualified opportunity fund, which is just a kind of a pass-through entity that raises funds from investors who want to take advantage of this tax cut. The goal of the policy was explicitly to create jobs, which is what this paper is studying. I think that's great. It had bipartisan support. And so what's the paper going to do? It's going to look at the effect of being designated as an opportunity zone on job growth in a particular geography. It's going to use a simple diff and diff that compares places that were designated to places that were eligible but not designated. Then there's a bunch of findings, but kind of like the headline number is that being designated as an opportunity zone tract increases the 2-year employment growth between 2017 and 2019 by about 3 to 4.5 percentage points. So my comments on this, so broadly, my take on this paper is I think this paper is super important. In terms of the outcomes being studied in this session, I think, in a lot of ways, job growth is the one that we want to know most about, both because it's the explicit goal of the policy. So it's just from a policy evaluation perspective, that's in some sense what you care about. And also, from a welfare perspective, you could think of job growth as being kind of first order. So I think that's really nice. I think the paper is definitely barking up the right tree in terms of the outcomes it's looking at. It's using a very sensible and credible research design. And then this bottom line result of large employment effects, I think is obviously policy relevant. I'm going to have basically 3 comments, and I'll probably only have time to get to 2 of them. So the comments are going to center around timing, which came up in a couple of the other discussions on when should we expect these effects to materialize, and particularly on the job growth margin. I'll have some things to say about measurement and the size of the effects being documented. And then the last thing, because it's a diff and diff paper, if I have time to get to it, I have to beat up on the parallel trends, but I don't know that I'll get there. Okay, so on timing, right? So the paper, the main outcome variable in this paper is the 2-year job growth rate between 2017 and 2019. But in terms of thinking through the timeline here, it's important to remember that the chronology of how this policy was passed, the final regulations that actually implemented the tax incentives weren't issued until the end of 2019. So it was unclear from the perspective of an investor how exactly the capital gains tax relief was going to work and how long you had to hold things and which types of investment qualified and things like that. And this issue of having this not fully specified tax credit was a big deal for fundraising for these qualified opportunity funds. There's notoriously difficult for these QFs to raise capital prior to that date. This is just Wall Street Journal article kind of highlighting this. This is from October of 2019, basically saying that every fund manager is saying it's really hard to gain traction on fundraising here. Things are slower than expected. That's not surprising. Given that the regulations haven't even been finalized yet, and even if they were, this is a new market for a lot of investors, and so they're obviously going to be hesitant to give us our money. So in terms of thinking about how much money could have possibly been invested between 2017 and 2019, it's important to keep in mind that the size of the pot is not as big as had intended to be or as it might eventually be. The other thing to keep in mind here in terms of the timeline is that the boundaries of these opportunity zones themselves weren't actually finalized or published until July of 2018. Okay, so although capital had been raised, it's likely that very little of it had been actually deployed prior to this date because people didn't actually know where the tax benefits were, where you would qualify for these tax benefits. And this is probably why some of the other papers in the session haven't gone after the kind of this aggressive first order, most important outcome, which is job growth. It's just a quote from the first paper in the session saying it's, in some sense, it may be too early to test the effects of the policy like this on job growth, just because of how things have played out timeline. So I think one thing that for me would have been really helpful in reading through the paper is a lot more institutional detail, just kind of narrative detail on the investment timelines for a typical qualified opportunity fund, right? Information on how much money had been raised. I know there's the CEA number of 75 billion, but kind of digging into the weeds on that just with some anecdotes would I think be really helpful for just gauging the plausibility. One particularly useful anecdote given the authors of the paper is if you look at kind of one of the earlier qualified opportunity funds to be found is this is Skybridge Opportunity Zone structured as a REIT. Anthony Scaramucci was in some sense the founder of this fund. And the authors of the paper should know a lot about kind of the inner workings of this fund because Morris was on the board of directors of this fund, at least for most of 2019. And so I did a little bit of digging on this, and I was able to came across kind of high-level promotional slides out there for this Skybridge Qualified Opportunity Fund. And if you look at the timeline that they're using in their marketing materials, you'll see that they're intending to raise capital all the way through 2021, and the properties that they're planning to develop in these opportunity zones with that capital are going to be developed at most optimistically throughout the early 2020. So that what could have happened between 2017 and 2019 is very much just the tip of the iceberg in terms of job creation here, right? You see, they don't have properties being managed by professional developers or professional management companies until about 2027. So I think more details like this, obviously Skybridge is probably not the typical example. This is a real estate development firm. There's other ways to invest. You could invest directly in the equity of local businesses. And so I'm not saying there's no scope for job creation here, just more details on exactly the mechanisms through which that happened would have helped me out a lot as I read through it. So that's kind of one of my main comments. The other set of comments I have are related and kind of on the issue of measurement.
5-minute warning.
Okay, cool. So again, on measurement. So the headline finding from the paper is that being designated as an opportunity zone increased the 2-year growth rate in job growth rate in the average opportunity zone track by about 3 to 4.5 percentage points. So I think it's important to step back and just ask the question, just how big is this effect, right? And there's a couple of ways to put this into perspective. One is just to take a look at the summary stats in the paper themselves. Alina showed this. This is for eligible tracks, the pre-period 2-year job growth rate. So between 2015 and 2017, if you look at all eligible tracks, the average 2-year job growth rate in that period prior to the policy being passed was about 4 percentage points. So if you judge it relative to that benchmark, what the paper's saying is that being designated as an opportunity zone doubled the job growth rate in these tracks relative to what it was chugging along at prior to the policy being implemented. But again, it's important to remember that the boundaries of these areas weren't actually drawn or fully known until July of 2018. So that 3 to 4.5 percentage point increase in the job growth rate that's being documented happens over it can't have happened prior to July of 2018. So it must have happened in the last 6 months of 2018, which means if you gross that up to a 2-year job growth rate to really compare it to that pre-year 15 to 17 growth rate, we're really looking at an effect here that's approximately about 8 times the pre-period job growth rate, which is a massive effect. So I think some discussion of the magnitudes here, and again, kind of the mechanism through which channels could we be achieving this large job growth rate would be very, very helpful. And another related to measurement, another thing is that the implied effect size here could be even larger after we take into account the measurement error in the outcome. So Alina mentioned a little bit briefly the data source that's being used here. So this was really interesting. There's this data source I had never heard of. This is called Your Economy Time Series. So it's establishment level employment data. So each establishment, it just counts the number of employees there. And then what the paper does is it sums that up within census tracts and time periods. And so this is kind of works like Dun & Bradstreet or some other commercial databases that are out there. But it's important to think about what the measurement error in this data is. This isn't like the census of establishments. This is collected by a company called Info Group, which basically calls businesses and asks them how many employees they have. And if you look into kind of the details of how that works, about half of the businesses they call, they can't get a verified employment number for. And so what they end up doing is that for about half of the establishments in the sample, the actual employment counts are modeled. They're imputed based off of kind of what it's assuming is a machine learning model underneath this saying, well, given what we can verify, what will we predict for these businesses that we can't? And so there's scope for substantial measurement error here in the key dependent variable, which would again kind of attenuate the effects being estimated. So that 3 to 4.5 percentage point effect, if you've got 50% of your data, let's say very pessimistically, 50% of your data is, can't be trusted, which I don't think that's true. But like if you're to take the most pessimistic viewpoint, that would say, again, you should blow these effects up by another 2 times, which means we're really looking at 16 times pre-period mean growth rates effects of an opportunity zone designation here, which I think is, at that point you're looking quite large, and I think that would suggest, you need to dig into kind of do some data validation here to get around some of the measurement error issues. Okay, I don't think I probably have 30 seconds, Dan?
1 minute.
1 minute. Okay, so all right, so I do have time to get to it, but I'm not really gonna beat up on it too much. So. The key problem with the key challenge with any diff and diff paper, every paper in this session has sort of used a very similar design, is to say, well, it's not clear that the trends and the outcomes would have been the same in these 2 areas in the absence of this policy change. You can kind of look at the raw data, which, I appreciate this paper plots the raw data, which is very important to do. If you look at this, the raw data on the left-hand side, these are those 2-year employment growth rates. And then what Alina showed you on the right-hand side, which is the Windsorized version of that. And if you just kind of look at this and say, in which year was a policy put into effect? Well, if you look on the right-hand side, you might say it was put into effect in 2017, which is when this happened. But on the left-hand side, you have to squint a little bit harder to see that, which raises the question, again, kind of related to the data, why is it that Windsorization matters so much here at the census tract level? Like at an individual establishment level, I could see that being a massive, massive deal. But once you aggregate it up to the census tract, Windsorization is really switching not just the level of the effect here, but also kind of the direction, right? Which is interesting because it does raise the question, is what's going on here is these are shrinking places in the policy stemming job losses, or is it unlike like on the left-hand panel, what the raw data would suggest is that it's accelerating job growth. I'm not sure which of these 2 it is, but some discussion there would be helpful as well. Okay, so bottom line, like I said, I think this is a super important paper. I think this is the most important outcome to be studying. I think the paper deserves a ton of credit for going after that outcome. I think it deserves even more credit for doing so using a credible research design. My take is that, I think it's a little too early to tell, to sort of close the book on this. For this paper specifically, more discussion on kind of the mechanisms and the institutional details on these funds, as well as sort of some robustness around measurement and pre-trends would be very helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. I want to say thank you to the organizers, the presenters, all the participants and attendees. But now I want to give the authors a chance to respond to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a great discussion. So in terms of timing, I just want to clarify that we include 2-year growth periods from 2017 to 2019, and we include 2019 as well. So we know from CAA report that the qualified opportunity zone funds raised $75 billion that wouldn't have existed because of the opportunity zone legislation. So the timing, in terms of timing, we do include 2019. So hopefully that clarifies, when the growth actually could have happened. In terms of the data set, we include a few sites that compare this data set to other standard BLS data sets. It's pretty similar. I think there's some measurement error, but it's not as huge as I think you think it is. And in terms of, I think we haven't talked about the parallel trends, and if my co-authors want to chime in, please go ahead.
I'll chime in just once. First, when we wrote this, we expected a 0. So it's not like we were expecting a big number. I think the big number surprised us a lot, which is why we've kicked the tires. We've tried to kick the tires every which way to see where the heck was this coming from. That's why we did the rural metropolitan split. We did Windsorizing because when some of the tracks that were smaller had huge job growth numbers, how much do you want that to impact your standard errors? And then finally, of course, Anthony, this was not a purely random experiment. The tracks were systematically different ahead of time, and we knew that. So the question is, how do you actually convince people visually that your pre-trends are reasonable. And that's where we came up with this forecasting exercise. If all you knew was the data from 2017 and before and the observables, what would you have forecast? And then you compare that to what actually happened. And then that gap sort of may show you the impact of the policy depending on how random the policy was implemented based on unobservables.
Morris, I have a suggestion. It wouldn't be a bad idea, since we have slightly different ways of doing this. Maybe we should flip outcome variables and each do each other's outcome variables with our own thing and see if we see what results we get. I think that should be a relatively easy thing to do.
Great.
We could handle this offline, but I'm sure Kevin will be able to make this happen. That's
I love that idea, if I understand it.
Yeah, we just take you just the other.
We'll have to check if we're allowed to share the data.
Oh, okay. Or we can figure out some way to do it. I mean, I'm sure.
Yes.
We can send you our code. You can do whatever. I mean, it's not.
Good. Yeah, we'd love that. We want to get to the bottom of this, because if this policy did create jobs, even not in the aggregate, but in just targeted tracks, then we can compare it to other policies that we think might also create jobs and talk about what's cost effective and what isn't. But I have to say, we expected a zero. We were not looking. This was a huge surprise to us, and probably to you too, Ed.
Indeed.
Yeah, Anthony, thank you for that very thoughtful discussion too.
Thank you, everyone.
And thank you to Dan for chairing.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks to everybody.
Bye. Thanks.
Good evening.